Namaste, dear friends. Take a deep breath. Let this moment settle around you like morning mist over a quiet lake. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt like you're doing everything right? Working hard, chasing goals, following the path you were told would lead to happiness. But still, something feels missing? Like no matter how much you accomplish, how much you gather, the feeling of true peace always seems just out of reach. Buddhism teaches us something profound. Peace isn't something we find out there. It's something we uncover within. The secret isn't in doing more, but in seeing differently. Today, we'll explore 7 timeless Buddhist teachings that illuminate the path to lasting happiness. Some of them might surprise you, especially the 5th one. It holds a key that most people overlook, yet it has the power to change how you experience life entirely. So, if you're ready, let's take this journey together. Let's begin. 1. Live in the present moment. The rain had just stopped. The temple grounds were soaked in the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. A gentle mist curled around the stone pathways, clinging to the wooden beams of the old meditation hall. Somewhere in the distance, a single bird called out. A brief, sweet note that faded as quickly as it had come. I sat beneath the Bodhi tree, legs crossed, hands resting lightly in my lap. A cup of warm tea sat beside me, wisps of steam curling into the cool morning air. And yet, my mind wasn't here. It was running, darting between the tangled threads of yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's worries. The words of an unfinished conversation, the weight of an old mistake, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It was as if I was everywhere but here, lost in places that no longer existed or had yet to arrive. The abbot, an old monk with a gentle smile and a gaze that seemed to see right through the noise of the world, had noticed my distraction. He walked toward me, his bare feet making no sound on the damp stone. Without a word, he lowered himself onto the ground beside me and gestured toward the tree. "Do you see this tree?" he asked softly. I nodded, unsure where this was going. It does not regret the storm that passed last night, nor does it worry about whether the sun will shine tomorrow. It simply is. I looked at the Bodhi tree, its broad leaves still glistening with rain, its roots deeply embedded in the earth. It stood there, undisturbed by time, existing fully in this moment. The monk continued, "You were like this tree, or at least you were when you were a child. Do you remember how, as a child, you could lose yourself completely in play? How an afternoon felt endless because you were fully in it. But as we grow older, we forget. We fill our minds with regrets, anxieties, distractions. We leave the present moment again and again, chasing illusions." I wanted to argue, to explain that life wasn't that simple. There were things to plan for, responsibilities to bear. But something in his words struck a chord so deep that I simply sat there, silent. "Take a breath," he said. I did. "Do you feel it?" I nodded. "That breath is all that is real. The past is a memory. The future is imagination. But this," he tapped his fingers lightly against the stone beside us. "This is where life happens." For the first time in what felt like a long time, I allowed myself to truly arrive. I noticed the weight of my body against the earth, the warmth of the tea, the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I had been chasing moments, running ahead of myself, trying to grasp happiness in a place where it didn't exist. Anywhere but here. I thought back to how often my mind had stolen me from life itself. Walking to work, but lost in thoughts of what needed to be done. Eating a meal, but already thinking about the next task. Talking to a loved one, but half present, checking my phone or replaying a past conversation. How many moments had I missed? How many simple joys had slipped through my fingers? I remembered a friend telling me once, "Life is like tea. If you drink it quickly, distracted, you miss the flavor. But if you drink it slowly, you taste everything." I looked down at my untouched tea, now lukewarm, and smiled. The monk spoke again, his voice as steady as the rain that had just passed. "The mind will always wander. It is its nature. But each time you notice it drifting, gently bring it back. Like a candle flame flickering in the wind, return it to stillness." He stood up, brushing the damp fabric of his robe. "And when you eat," he added with a knowing glance, "just eat." That night, I practiced something simple. I ate my meal without a phone, without distractions, without rushing. I felt the warmth of the food, noticed the textures, the flavors. It was such a small thing, but it was life. And for the first time in a long time, I was there for it. 2. Practice compassion. There's a story I once heard, and like all good stories, it stayed with me long after I first encountered it. Maybe because I saw a little of myself in it. Maybe because, in one way or another, we all carry invisible burdens. It was about a traveler who walked through the world with a heavy bag slung over his shoulder. Inside, he carried stones, small ones, large ones, some jagged, others smooth. But no matter their size, each stone represented a grievance, a betrayal, a wound he could not let go of. Each time someone hurt him, an insult, a broken promise, a deep disappointment, he reached down, picked up a new stone, and placed it in his bag. "This," he would say to himself, "will remind me never to trust again, never to be caught off guard, never to be hurt like that a second time." And so his collection grew. At first, he barely noticed the weight. Pebble here, a small rock there. What harm could it do? But as the years passed, as more and more stones found their way into his bag, he felt it. His steps grew slower. His back ached. His heart, too, felt heavy, though he couldn't quite explain why. One evening, after an especially long and tiring journey, the traveler stopped by a well in a small village. An old sage sat nearby, watching the world with the quiet patience of someone who had seen many lifetimes of suffering and joy. The sage saw the traveler's weary expression and the way his body sagged beneath the invisible burden he carried. He asked, "What is it that you carry in your bag?" The traveler sighed. "These are my reminders. Each stone represents a pain I have suffered, a wrong that was done to me. I keep them so I will never forget." The sage nodded, considering his words. Then he smiled gently and said, "And tell me, do those who have wronged you feel the weight of these stones?" The traveler was quiet. He had never thought about that. The sage continued, "Or is it only you who carries them?" The words struck the traveler like a bell ringing through the empty night. He felt the strain in his shoulders, the dull ache in his heart. For so long, he had believed that holding onto these stones would protect him. But all they had done was weigh him down. With trembling hands, he reached into his bag and took out a stone. He held it for a long time, feeling its rough surface. Then, finally, he let it fall. The sound of it hitting the earth was softer than he expected. He took another, and with each stone he dropped, his burden lightened. That night, for the first time in years, the traveler slept soundly, unshackled by the weight of his own past. I think about this story often, because the truth is we all carry stones. Some are small, petty grievances, misunderstandings that we refuse to let go of. Others are heavier, betrayals, heartbreaks, wounds that have shaped the way we see the world. But the question remains, who really carries the weight of our resentment? It's easy to believe that holding on to anger somehow protects us, that remembering every slight keeps us from being hurt again. But in reality, the people who wronged us, they aren't the ones bearing the burden. We are. I used to think of compassion as something soft, something reserved for those who deserved it. But the older I get, the more I understand. Compassion is not about excusing harm. It's about freeing ourselves from the endless cycle of suffering. There was a time in my life when I held on to anger like a shield. I thought that if I stayed resentful, I could control the pain. If I replayed the moment enough times in my head, I could rewrite the ending. But it never worked. The past remained the past, and I remained trapped in it. Then one day I tried something different. Instead of asking, "How could they do this to me?" I asked, "What pain might they have been carrying?" And just like that, the weight began to shift. It didn't mean I forgot. It didn't mean what happened was okay. But it did mean that I no longer let it dictate my peace. Compassion isn't just about helping others. It's about setting ourselves free. The Buddha once said, "If you light a lamp for someone else, it will also brighten your own path." And maybe, just maybe, if we let go of the stones we carry, we'll find that the road ahead is lighter than we ever imagined. The first time I truly understood simplicity, I was sitting on the worn wooden steps of an old monastery, watching the wind play with the fallen leaves. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of incense and damp earth. It was the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty but full of something deeper than words. An elderly monk sat beside me, his robe a deep shade of saffron, faded at the edges. He had been watching me for a while, his eyes twinkling with a kind of knowing that made me feel both exposed and comforted at the same time. Finally, he spoke. "You seem troubled," he said simply. I sighed. I don't know why, but I always feel like something is missing, like I'm always reaching for something just out of grasp. The monk nodded as if he had heard these words 1,000 times before. "Let me tell you a story. There was once a great king who had everything. Gold, jewels, the finest silk, the most exquisite food. He lived in a palace that stretched so wide it took an entire day just to walk from one end to the other. And yet, despite all this, the king was restless. He found no joy in his riches, no satisfaction in his power. One day, he heard of a wise monk who lived in the mountains, a man rumored to hold the secret to true happiness. The king, desperate to fill the emptiness inside him, set out on a journey to find the monk. After days of travel, he finally arrived at the monastery. The monk welcomed him with a warm smile and a bowl of simple rice. The king wasted no time. "Tell me, wise one," he said, "why am I not happy? I have everything a man could ever want, and yet, I feel a constant hunger for more." The monk studied the king for a moment before asking, "If you were thirsty, would drinking the ocean satisfy you?" The king blinked. "Of course not. The ocean is too vast, too salty. It would never quench my thirst." The monk smiled. "Then why do you think endless wealth and possessions would satisfy your heart?" The king was silent. The monk continued, "You have built a great palace, but your mind is still restless. Happiness is not found in having, but in being." The king left that day, confused but intrigued. He started to notice how each new treasure he acquired only made him crave another. Slowly, he began giving away his possessions one by one. The more he let go, the lighter he felt. And over time, he discovered that the greatest treasure of all was not gold or jewels, but the peace that comes with needing nothing. The old monk beside me let the story settle in the air between us before finally speaking again. "What do you think the king learned?" I hesitated. "That, the more we chase, the more we suffer?" The monk nodded. "Yes, but even more than that, he learned that what we think we need is often what weighs us down the most." I looked down at my hands. The past few years of my life had been a blur of endless goals, a constant need for more success, more achievements, more possessions. I had believed that happiness was something to be earned, something I would reach once I had accumulated enough. But what was enough? The truth was, the more I got, the more I wanted. I had been drinking the ocean, expecting it to quench my thirst. I thought back to the moments in my life when I had felt the most at peace. They weren't the times I had achieved something grand or bought something expensive. They were the simple moments, sitting quietly with a friend, walking barefoot on a beach, drinking a cup of tea while watching the rain. The monk must have seen the realization settle in my face because he chuckled softly. The modern world tells us that more is the answer. More possessions, more distractions, more everything. But Buddhism teaches us that true contentment comes not from having more, but from needing less. I glanced around the monastery, taking in its simplicity. There were no extravagant decorations, no unnecessary luxuries. Just a wooden bench, a few candles, and a garden where lotus flowers bloomed in the still water. And yet, there was a peace here that I had never found in all the expensive places I had been. I looked back at the monk. "So, where do I start?" He smiled. "Start small. Look around you. Is there something you own but never use? Let it go. Is there a thought you keep replaying, something you can't change? Release it. Simplicity isn't about deprivation. It's about making space for what truly matters. That night, I returned to my small guest room in the monastery and looked at the few things I had brought with me. A book I had carried but never opened. A watch I kept checking even though time moved the same with or without it. A journal filled not with reflections but with lists of things I needed to do, achieve, become. One by one, I set them aside. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in years. I used to believe that if I held on tightly enough, things wouldn't slip away. That if I clenched my fists around love, success, and certainty, they would stay safe and secure, exactly as I wanted them to be. But life has a way of teaching us differently. There was a time when I held onto a dream so fiercely that I didn't realize it had already withered in my grasp. I had poured years into it. Late nights, early mornings, endless effort. It was supposed to be my future, the thing that defined me. But when it started slipping through my fingers instead of adapting, I gripped even harder. I ignored the signs, refused to see the cracks forming, convinced that if I just tried a little more, things would fall back into place. But they didn't. One evening, I found myself at the shore, walking aimlessly as the waves lapped at my feet. The sky was painted in soft pastels, the kind of colors that only appear when the world is preparing to rest. I reached down and scooped up a handful of sand. As I lifted it, I tightened my fingers around it, and slowly, grain by grain, the sand slipped through the gaps. No matter how hard I held on, it trickled away, carried back to the earth by forces far greater than my grasp. Then I loosened my grip. The remaining sand settled naturally in my palm, resting there effortlessly. And just like that, something in me shifted. I had spent so long gripping onto things that were already leaving, relationships, expectations, even parts of myself that I had outgrown, fighting against the natural flow of life. But maybe, just maybe, peace wasn't about holding on. Maybe it was about letting go. Buddhism teaches that attachment is the root of suffering. And yet, we attach ourselves to so much material things, people, identities, even the idea of who we think we should be. We convince ourselves that if we just have this person, this job, this version of success, then we will be happy. But happiness doesn't work that way. It isn't something we trap and keep forever. It's something that flows when we stop grasping for it. I remember a story I once heard about a man who lived his entire life in pursuit of wealth. No matter how much he gained, it was never enough. He wanted more. More security, more possessions, more power. But the more he chased, the more elusive true contentment became. One day, an old monk asked him to imagine that he was drowning in a river. "What would you do?" the monk asked. "I'd struggle to stay afloat," the man replied. "And if there were a heavy stone in your hand, I'd have to let it go," the man admitted. The monk smiled. "Then why do you insist on drowning in life while refusing to let go of the weight you carry?" For a long time, I carried my own stones, resentment, expectations, the idea that things had to go a certain way. But holding on to something tightly doesn't make it stay. In fact, sometimes it pushes it further away. Letting go isn't about giving up. It's about understanding that some things are not meant to be forced. That peace isn't found in clenching our fists around what we fear to lose, but in opening our hands and trusting that whatever remains is what was always meant to be. I still catch myself gripping too tightly sometimes. Old habits don't disappear overnight. But now, when I feel that familiar tightness in my chest, the desperate urge to control what is slipping away, I remind myself of the sand. I take a breath, open my hands, and let it be. And in that space, in that surrender, I find something unexpected: freedom. I used to think happiness was something I had to chase, that if I just worked a little harder, achieved a little more, or reached the next milestone, then I would finally feel it, settled, fulfilled, complete. But the truth is, no matter how much I gained, there was always something missing. It was as if I was carrying a bucket with a small hole in the bottom. No matter how much I poured into it, it never seemed to fill. Then one evening, quite unexpectedly, I stumbled upon the simplest remedy. It wasn't a grand revelation, nor was it a sudden moment of enlightenment. It happened while I was sitting on my porch, a cup of tea warming my hands, watching the sky shift from blue to gold as the sun melted into the horizon. A thought came to me, quiet but persistent. This is enough. Not the kind of enough that feels like settling, but the kind that wraps around you like a soft blanket on a chilly night. The kind that says, right here, right now, you have everything you need. It's funny how easily we overlook the things we already have. Our minds are wired to scan for what's missing, what's wrong, what could be better. We scroll through pictures of people who seem happier, wealthier, more successful. We compare. We crave. And in doing so, we blind ourselves to the quiet abundance already surrounding us. I once heard a story about a man who lived in a small village. He was always dissatisfied, always searching for something more. One day, he traveled to visit a wise teacher, hoping for guidance. "Master," he said, "I have worked hard, yet I feel like I have nothing. What should I do?" The teacher handed him a piece of parchment and a brush. "Tonight, before you sleep," he said, "write down 3 things you are grateful for. Do this every night for a month, and then return to me." The man was skeptical but followed the instructions. At first, he struggled. His mind kept returning to his frustrations, his desires, the things he had not yet accomplished. But slowly, something shifted. One night, he wrote, "I am grateful for the sound of rain on the roof." Another night, for my wife's laughter at dinner. Then, for the warmth of my morning tea. Small things, everyday things, things he had never really noticed before. By the time he returned to the teacher, he no longer needed to ask the question. He had found his answer. The life he had once seen as lacking was now overflowing. Not because it had changed, but because he had. I used to think gratitude was something reserved for grand moments, celebrations, promotions, the big things we mark on our calendars. But it's not. It's in the details, the pauses, the tiny joys tucked into ordinary days. It's in the way sunlight spills through the window in the morning, the way a friend remembers your favorite song, the way the first sip of coffee feels on a sleepy afternoon. Gratitude doesn't erase difficulties. It doesn't mean pretending life is perfect. It simply shifts the focus from what's missing to what's present. And when we make a habit of looking for these small gifts, something remarkable happens. We find more of them. I started keeping a gratitude journal just like the man in the story. At first, it felt forced, like another task on my endless to-do list. But soon, I noticed how it changed me. Instead of waking up and immediately thinking about what needed to be fixed, I began looking for what was already whole. Try it. Tonight, before you sleep, write down 3 things. A warm meal, kind word, a moment of laughter. Over time, you'll start to see life differently. You'll start to feel it. This quiet, steady hum of enoughness. And maybe, just maybe, you'll realize that happiness was never something to chase. It was something waiting to be noticed all along. I used to think meditation was something only monks did. Something for people who lived in mountain temples, untouched by the rush and noise of the real world. It was something distant, abstract, maybe even a little intimidating. My mind was too busy, too loud. How could I possibly sit in silence and do nothing? Then, one morning, I found myself sitting on a wooden bench in a quiet garden, listening to the sound of rustling bamboo. It had rained the night before, and the scent of wet earth clung to the air. A monk, old and serene, sat a few steps away, his eyes half closed in meditation. I watched him for a while, wondering what it was like to be so still, so unmoved by the passing of time. He must have sensed my gaze because, after a while, he opened his eyes and smiled. "Your mind is restless," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. I laughed nervously. "Always," I admitted. He nodded, as if he had seen 1,000 minds just like mine. "Come," he said, patting the space next to him. "Sit." I hesitated. "I don't think I'm very good at meditating." His smile deepened. "That is like saying you are not good at breathing. You do not have to be good at it. You just do it." I sighed but sat down anyway. The bench was cool against my skin. The air, thick with the scent of moss and rain, felt alive. The monk closed his eyes again, and after a moment, I did too. Listen, he said. Not with your ears, but with your whole being. I tried. At first, all I could hear was the chatter in my own head. A constant stream of thoughts tumbling over one another, like waves crashing on a shore. Did I remember to answer that email? What should I eat for lunch? I wonder if meditation will actually help me? The monk's voice interrupted my spiral. Do not fight your thoughts, he said. Let them rise, let them fall, like clouds passing in the sky. I took a breath, and then another. The sky of my mind was stormy, full of shifting clouds, but I tried not to grasp at them. I just sat. I listened. First, nothing happened. But then, slowly, gently, I began to notice the spaces between the thoughts, the brief pauses, the quiet. I felt my shoulders relax, my breath slow. I was still thinking, of course, but I wasn't lost in it. I was watching it, as if from a slight distance, like a traveler pausing on the side of the road to observe the passing scenery. After what felt like minutes but could have been an hour, the monk spoke again. Do you feel it? He asked. I opened my eyes, surprised at the sense of calm that had settled over me. Feel what? I asked. He chuckled. The stillness. It has always been there. You just had to stop long enough to notice it. I didn't say anything, but I knew he was right. I used to think meditation was about emptying the mind, about achieving some perfect state of silence. But it's not. It's about making space. It's about stepping out of the constant motion of thoughts and realizing that beneath it all, there is something steady, something quiet, something always present. The Buddha once said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." And I think that's what meditation is. It's not about escaping life, but about learning to be fully present within it. After that day, I made meditation a habit. Not because I was good at it, but because I had finally understood what it was for. It wasn't about doing nothing. It was about remembering something, that underneath all the noise, the rushing, the worrying, there is a stillness we can return to, a home within ourselves. Now, each morning before the world wakes up, I sit. I close my eyes. I listen. And in that quiet space between thoughts, I find myself again. There was a time in my life when I thought peace was something I had to earn. That if I pushed myself hard enough, worked more, sacrificed more, achieved more, then maybe, just maybe, I would finally reach some mythical state of balance. But balance doesn't work that way. You don't find it at the end of an exhausting journey, waiting like a prize. You find it in the way you walk the path itself. I learned this lesson, not from books, not even from the wisdom of others, but from my own exhaustion. There was a period when I was caught in the grip of extremes, swinging wildly between discipline and indulgence, between overworking and burnout, between deep solitude and desperate socializing. I would starve myself of rest, then collapse into days of doing nothing. I would push my body too hard, then resent it for not keeping up. I would chase productivity like a starving man, only to find myself empty at the end of each day. One morning, after an especially restless night, I found myself at a small temple on the outskirts of town. I hadn't planned to go there, but something in me was seeking stillness. The air was thick with the scent of incense, and a few monks moved quietly through the courtyard, their robes whispering against the stone floor. I watched as one of the younger monks struggled to carry 2 buckets of water from the well. He had filled them to the brim, and as he walked, water sloshed over the edges, drenching his robe. An older monk, watching from nearby, approached him with a gentle smile. "You carry too much," he said simply. The young monk frowned. "But I must bring enough water." The older monk nodded. "Yes, but if you carry too much, you spill what is precious before you even arrive." The younger monk looked down at the buckets, watching as the water continued to spill with each unsteady step. The older monk continued. "If you had filled them only halfway, you would have reached your destination without losing so much." Something in his words struck me. I had been carrying my own buckets too full of expectations, of responsibilities, of relentless self-judgment. And in doing so, I had lost so much along the way. My energy, my peace, my ability to simply be. I thought about Siddhartha before he became the Buddha. how he had once lived in a palace of excess, surrounded by every pleasure imaginable, yet still felt empty, and how he had then swung to the opposite extreme, starving himself, denying every earthly comfort, pushing his body to its breaking point in search of enlightenment. But it was only when he abandoned both extremes that he found the truth, the middle way. Neither indulgence nor deprivation, neither excess nor absence, only balance. I had been telling myself that peace was something I would find later, when I had done enough. But the middle way teaches something different. Peace is found in how we live, not in what we achieve. That day at the temple, I sat for a long time beneath an old fig tree, feeling the weight of my own extremes. And I asked myself, where am I carrying too much? Where am I emptying myself before I even arrive? I started making small changes. I stopped treating rest as something I had to deserve. I let myself work hard without pushing to the point of exhaustion. I allowed moments of joy without guilt. I embraced the quiet in between the noise. And slowly, I felt something shift. The wild pendulum that had been swinging inside me for so long began to settle. The Buddha once said, "The middle way is the path to peace." And I have found this to be true, not as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived experience. So if you find yourself caught in extremes, ask yourself, where am I spilling my own water? How can I carry my burdens with more balance? And then, like a traveler adjusting their steps on a winding road, find your own middle way. And so, dear friends, we come to the end of this journey, but in truth, the journey never really ends. Every breath, every step, every moment is an opportunity to begin again. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: peace is not a destination, but a way of walking through life. It's in how we embrace the present, how we let go, how we soften our grip on things that do not serve us. Take a moment now. Close your eyes if you wish. Feel the breath moving in and out of your body. This is your home. This stillness has always been here, waiting for you to return. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. What spoke to you the most? What lesson are you taking with you today? Your thoughts may be the guiding light for someone else walking this path. And if you wish to continue exploring these teachings together, consider subscribing to Lotus Light Teachings. This is more than just a channel. It's a space for wisdom, reflection, and gentle reminders to live fully, deeply, and peacefully. Until next time, may you walk your path with grace, may your heart be light, and may you always remember, the lotus blooms not by reaching, but by simply being. Be well, be present, be free.